lectures. Today, we're going to discuss the early United States. So we talked about the Constitution and how it was written in the Constitutional Convention. But just because they wrote it didn't mean that it was going to become the law of the land. The Constitution still needed to be approved by the states. And according to the Constitution, 9 states needed to ratify that Constitution. And this ratification or approval came in the form of a yes or no vote on the Constitution that was held in all of the colonies. And so after the first 9 states ratified, they set up the elections, the first elections that would be held in 1789. And the first U.S. government was elected, and a lot of the people who were elected to that government are familiar faces. George Washington pretty much ran unopposed for president. The first cabinet, basically the advisors to the president, included Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, John Adams was the vice president, and also John Jay was the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And this first government had a lot of work cut out for it. First, they had to create all the institutions of government. Remember, institutions are kind of the organizations and the places where government power is exercised. So they had to create the first kind of offices for collecting taxes, for the army, for all of those things. Those all needed to be started kind of from scratch. Also, the Bill of Rights was passed kind of in this first Congress in order to calm everybody's fears about this new federal government that had just been elected. Also, new taxes were levied, and these new taxes weren't popular with everyone. In fact, one tax on whiskey actually led to an open rebellion called the Whiskey Rebellion, in which people basically revolted against these new taxes. The United States also created a central bank, a bank of the United States, to print money and basically lend money to the other banks in the country. This was very controversial for a number of reasons, including the fact they thought that this gave too much power to kind of one bank, or that kind of it gave the federal government too much control over the economy. And then finally, even though George Washington had warned against it, the first political parties were created. And these two first political parties kind of give us a view into the idea that Americans have kind of always had disagreements about kind of the vision or the future of the country. The first parties were the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. And the Federalists tended to believe that the national government should be supreme over the states, whereas Democratic Republicans believed that the state governments should be kind of supreme and have more power than the national government. They also disagreed on who should have the political power in the country. The Federalists tend to believe that it was the wealthy and educated who kind of had the training and understood enough about government in order to do what's best for the country. They feared that the common people would simply just act in their own interest and not do what was best for the country. The Democratic Republicans believed that political power should be in the landowners. Democratic Republicans believe that kind of all American citizens should kind of own land and be farmers. Which brings us to the economy. And the Federalists and Democratic Republicans even disagreed on the economy. The Federalists believed that manufacturing and industry was going to basically drive the American economy forward, whereas the Democratic Republicans wanted an agricultural society where all citizens were basically landowners. Federalists also believed the Constitution was loose, that basically they could kind of expand the powers of the federal government beyond just what was in the Constitution. The Democratic Republicans, believing firmly in states' rights, wanted a strict interpretation in which the federal government would really be limited to the things that the Constitution said that it could do. And also, they disagreed on taxes on trade, called tariffs. The Federalists tend to favor tariffs, because tariffs help industry by cutting down on kind of foreign competition. So the American factory doesn't have to compete with the British factory. But the farmers who relied on trade to basically sell their agricultural goods to Europe believed these tariffs hurt farmers. And so they thought that all the tariffs should be low or there should be no tariffs at all. So as you can see, our modern kind of political debate is really nothing new. Americans have always kind of disagreed about the future of the country. And the Supreme Court, for its part, has very little power given to it by the Constitution. The Constitution makes barely any mention of the Supreme Court. And so, Chief Justice John Marshall, who was the second Chief Justice after John Jay, decided that they needed to do something about this. The reason John Jay resigned is he said the court would never have enough powerful to be meaningful in the U.S. government. And so John Marshall decided that the court needed to basically do something to give itself power in kind of this new kind of division of powers, separation of powers, checks and balances. And so in a Supreme Court decision called Marbury v. Madison, the court actually ruled that it had the power of judicial review. So this is not a power in the Constitution. The Supreme Court kind of made it up. But Americans kind of looked at each other and said, you know, this is probably a pretty good idea. And they allow the court to decide whether laws or actions by the government are constitutional or are unconstitutional, and therefore basically null and void, illegal, and basically these laws then would not count. So the early presidents, a lot of people whom you've heard of before. John Adams was the second president after Washington kind of decided not to run for a third term. Thomas Jefferson would be elected after him, and then James Madison would be the fourth president of the United States kind of during this era. The election of 1800 was a very close one, and it was very interesting to look at kind of how this election played out in context of kind of our modern politics. And this election of 1800 was fiercely partisan, meaning that kind of the two political parties attacked each other rather than basically trying to come up with kind of a compromise or a solution to kind of the nation's problems. This election also had a lot of personal attacks, slander, dirty politics, and kind of very kind of brutal tactics to make sure you didn't vote for the other guy. And the two sides presented those two very different visions of the future that we looked at before. And in this election, kind of the start of politics as usual, kind of these partisan politics. For instance, Thomas Jefferson's supporters said of John Adams, he was a hideous hermaphroditical character, which has neither the force nor firmness of a man, nor the gentleness and sensibility of a woman. Pretty rough stuff. They also started a rumor that accused John Adams of wanting to secretly start a war with France. It wasn't true, but it didn't matter. People believed it, these negative acts. But Adams' supporters were no better. They called Jefferson a mean-spirited, low-lived fellow, the son of a half-breed Indian squaw, sired by a Virginia mulatto father, basically attacking even Jefferson's family. He was accused of having an affair with one of his slaves, and that rumor was used against him. He was also accused of being an atheist, because back in that time, if you weren't religious, basically they thought that you would not be a good member of government. And so this election was very brutal. And kind of not much has changed if we look at even our television today and these ads that we see. But Thomas Jefferson was elected in the year 1800, and he took the presidency. And the most important thing that happened in Jefferson's presidency was the Louisiana Purchase, which more than doubled the size of the United States. In the Louisiana Purchase, the United States bought this from France. Napoleon Bonaparte, who was basically fighting many wars in Europe for dominance over that continent, he was out of money, and wars are expensive. And so he needed money, and he also wanted the U.S. to be neutral and stay out of his European wars. And so he sold 529,920,000 acres of land for only about $15 million. That boils down to about 3 cents per acre, and it more than doubled the size of the United States. To put it in perspective, 1 acre is about it's about a football field. So 3 cents per football field of land. Very affordable, and it doubled the size of the United States. Incredibly important when we talk about the expansion of the country kind of across the American continent. And so there's a reason why the United States wants to expand in the 1800s. It's still a small country, but the population had been growing since the Revolution. Kind of more citizens are being born in the new United States, and there's a huge immigration boom of people from Europe and other places who are trying to take advantage of kind of the new United States and the opportunities that it was offering people. Also, with economics, the United States knows that more land equals more resources, and that'll equal more money and power. And also they understood that more people means that you need more jobs and land, and you need more economic growth to keep up with that population. And so the Louisiana Purchase was basically going to kind of solve all those problems at once. And so once the Louisiana Purchase happened, Thomas Jefferson sent 2 guys, Meriwether Lewis and Clark, as well as kind of their guide, a woman named Sacagawea, to go explore this new territory that was largely all wilderness and map it out for the rest of the country. And this was an expedition to try to find their way from these basically kind of the east all the way out to the Pacific Ocean. And they mapped out a big part of this new territory, and that kind of started the U.S. expansionism we will talk about later, for all of its positive and negative consequences. And if you want to learn more about Lewis Clark and Sacagawea's journey, an extra credit opportunity could be available to you. And so here's the route that they took, and they actually made it from St. Louis all the way out to the Pacific Ocean, going up the Missouri River and basically traveling through wilderness. But what this did is it mapped out the territory and it set up for the future of American expansion into the West.